So now I want to give like a few pointers, like where do we go after this? So first, how do I get started and how do I containerize stuff? Because some of us have already started and we already have Docker files, maybe Compose files, etc. But I also assume that many of us are like, okay, how do I, in concrete steps, like what do I do? This is my suggested containerization checklist. That's how I would personally do this. First, so I assume like organization where nothing is in containers. A few people have started to play with Docker, and but what do we do? Well, first we write a Docker file for one service in one app. If possible, the stuff that is painful to build, the stuff where we constantly have like library dependency issues, etc., because that's where we will have the biggest gain. So that's where people are going to be happy. So we start with that. Then we write Docker files for the other buildable services in that application. Then we write a Compose file for that application. And at this point, it's like kind of a checkpoint, because now we have this nice onboarding process where when you have a new developer on the team, you can tell them you install Docker, Docker Mac or Docker Windows or on Linux, then you clone that repo, Docker Compose up, and boom, you get your local dev environment. So that's a good gain. Even if you stop there, you already made something useful. And like, okay, now let's make sure that the devs are comfortable using that dev environment. If they don't, try to figure out why. Oh, maybe we screwed up the build process and the build process takes 15 minutes. So obviously they don't want to use it. So try to fix that. Then we can use that for CI and for QA and testing environments. It's a really good way to set up a CI pipeline. Then we can set up a CD pipeline, but for staging and QA. Like, don't deploy straight to production and containers on day one, but you can do that for testing environments because that's low risk. And then you can start looking at orchestration. So then you can start looking at kube deployment options, things like that. There are a few things that, coming with a Docker background, I felt like I was missing from Kube. And so, for instance, the ability to start multiple apps side by side. In Kube, if you want to do that, you will most likely use namespaces. So you will create, for each different app or for each different version of the app, you will create a different namespace. And for instance, if you have the blue stack and the green stack, and both of them have a Redis service, then if you put them in different namespaces, when you are in the blue stack, Redis resolves to the Redis in the blue stack. And if you are in the green stack, now when you resolve Redis, it resolves to the other IP address. Under the hood, that's where kubedns is doing some magic, because the full name of that Redis pod will be redis.blue.svc.cluster.local, where blue is the namespace. And when you are in the blue namespace, your DNS search includes blue.svc.cluster.local. What this means is that if you are in a namespace, any namespace, if you resolve, for instance, redis.default.svc.cluster.local, that will give you the IP address of service Redis in the default namespace. And you will be able to connect to it unless you have network policies. So keep that in mind as soon as you think about having multiple workloads on the cluster. For stateful services, my first advice is don't do that immediately. Like the easiest way to run a database is to not run the database. And by that, I don't mean rewrite all your code to not have database. No, I mean use a hosted database service. Or if you already have a database, then you already have a team that maintains that. If it works great, then great, don't change it. If you are using something external, that's fine too. You can integrate external services, whether like self-hosted or third-party, by using custom cluster IP services and external names. Yet there is also something called ambassadors that is super powerful. Now, if you really want to put your databases on a Kubernetes cluster, I advise that you look up volumes, persistent volume claims, storage plugins, stateful sets. HTTP traffic handling, I advise that you look into ingresses because service is a level 4 construct. So as soon as you want to do like vhost routing or path routing or routing with cookies, sticky affinity, etc., you will want to look at ingress. If you are on a cloud, use whatever is available there. If you are outside of the cloud, there is I think that the official ingress on Kube is the Nginx ingress. I personally find the configuration a little bit painful. Traffic is another one that, in my opinion, has a much nicer configuration method. Logging and metrics. Logging is delegated to the container engine, so you can just Google for how do I manage my logs with Docker, and you can just map that on Kube. Metrics on Kube clusters, you will typically want to run Prometheus, and another keyword will be hipster. Not hipster, but hipster. Now, managing configuration of our applications. Some people put configuration in the images. Please, I beg you, don't do that. It's the same thing as putting the password on a post-it on the screen, because at some point the image is going to leak somewhere. At some point some dev is going to run that image on the local machine, and because that's fine, except now you have your production passwords on the developer's machine. So you can put that in environment variables, kind of meh, but both Docker and Docker Swarm and Kube have a notion of secrets, which are a special thing where you can put like sensitive data like passwords, API tokens, etc., and then safely expose that to applications. Now, managing stack deployments, like what, I'm not really supposed to do all those kubectl apply, etc. all the time. So depending on the size of the stack and the team that you have, the best method will be a different thing. Sometimes having scripts calling kubectl is great. Sometimes you want to generate all this YAML that has been like generated by kubectl for us and commit that into the repo. You can also look into Helm, which is a kind of package manager for Kube, Spinnaker, which is what Netflix used for CD. The problem with Spinnaker is that to deploy it, you need Helm, and to deploy Helm, you need something else. So it's kind of, I'm going to build a tool so I can build a tool to build my tool. There is also Compose with a K and a bunch of other integrations coming up. Cluster federation, it's not that federation, but yeah. Oh, by the way, if you wonder like why the Kubernetes logo has 7 branches, that's because the original clustering system at Google was called Borg, like the evil characters in Star Trek, and the internal code name for Kubernetes at first was 7, because in Star Trek 7 is a more friendly Borg. And there is the concept of a cluster federation in Kubernetes, but it has nothing to do with the Star Trek Federation. So, but cluster federation lets you have multiple clusters and use that as a bigger cluster. If you, there was a question earlier about what if I have elevated latency, like then federation is usually the right tool to use. And developer experience, that's my last slide, but it's a pretty important one. When you start deploying on Kube, there is one thing that you should keep in mind. I mean, I would love to hear your feedback after this, but I think there are lots of concepts. This is complicated. This is not easy. And you want to make that easy for your developers. If you are the developer, then good luck. I mean, the good news is that you don't need to convince anybody else because you're already empowered to make the choice. But if you want to come back to your team and you're like, all right, people, everybody's using Kubernetes, and then you start explaining the services and deployments and etc., it's not always going to be super easy. So one thing that I think is key for adoption is to find like something, start with something easy and kind of grow from there. Think about how are we going to test this? Like, what should we install? Like, should we use Minikube? Should we use like personal dev clusters on GKE? How do I add a new app? How do I add a new service to my stack? Try to have runbooks, at least for yourself, for these very steps. I try to give you like a bunch of Lego bricks because with Kube you have many ways to do things, and I can't tell you this is the best way to do things because for at least maybe 20% of you, this won't be the best way to do things. There will be another method that will be better. So I try to give you many like basic building blocks, but then you have to explore and tinker and find what works best for you and for your team.